is our friend Brenden Nunes from the Kings Herald, also the Kings Pulse podcast. Brenden, we appreciate your time as always, my friend. Let's start with Domas. Does Domas's struggles versus Golden State impact the offseason plan offensively for the Kings in any way?
Thanks for having me as always, guys.
Pleasure.
I don't think so. I think that it honestly says a bit more about Looney than it does about Domas in my mind. I think that Looney is getting a lot of well-deserved respect throughout the course of these playoffs. But I do think that for Domas as an individual, which is something he talked about in his exit interviews, is that knocking down that mid-range jumper is really important. And I think we've seen him knock it down at an okay rate. The volume's just never been there. And with him, as he expressed, kind of taking that emphasis into the offseason, I think that if he can progress in that way individually, that's sort of enough to make up for some of what we saw led to his struggles in that first round. But when it comes down to it, they took the defending champs to 7, so still all right with how it went.
Do you think there was any thought before that, and even more thought now, to getting a 5 and sliding Domas to the 4 because of what we saw Kevon Looney do to him over the course of that series?
I don't really think so, because De'Aaron is also kind of a non-shooter. I think De'Aaron, Domas, and one other non-shooter just makes for a little bit of a tough lineup, and wasn't surprised to hear Monty McNair say, he does think that Domas can play both positions on both sides of the floor, but to me, that's more so I would never expect him to go up there and say, I think he can only do this one position. I would imagine that their plan is still to have him at the 5, but maybe you can find another 4 that can space the floor and also add a bit of rim protection. But I'd imagine that Domas stays at the 5.
Brenden Nunes is with us here, Kings Herald. Brenden, let me ask you, is it less likely that HB is a King now than before the Warriors series?
I'm really unsure on that one. I do think it is somewhat less likely because the final 2 games, he really wasn't getting much run. And I think one of the most telling individual stats game by game with Coach Brown is just minutes played. And there's a reason he wasn't out there. It was, says something about some of the other options that Sacramento had on their roster, but I still think it's a coin flip on if HB comes back or not. I don't think that game 6 and 7 left the best impression, but the off-court value that HB brings, the veteran leadership that everybody just raves about, level-headedness, I still think has a lot of value. It's just going to kind of depend what the rest of the league thinks of him at this point.
Don't you think, though, I mean, it's only 1 year, but with the success that they had and looking at, Domas and Fox setting the example, don't you think that those lessons of being a professional, et cetera, that they might have needed from HB are pretty much baked in now, and now it's purely a basketball decision, and can you upgrade there?
I think there's definitely an aspect to that. I absolutely think that, it's something that like De'Aaron will just have with him throughout the rest of his career, that Keegan and all of these guys will be able to take things from HB even if he's no longer around. I think that it's kind of the word that you used. If you can make an upgrade, then you do it. I think that's just kind of easier said than done. Sure. And I think the last thing you want is to be left with nothing in that spot.
Brenden Nunes is with us here on the Folsom Lake Honda Hotline. That's what I was going to ask you, Brenden. You look at HB, and his career in the postseason isn't good. His series against the Warriors wasn't good. Can this team improve and build upon what they did this year, bringing HB back as a key player in the starting 5?
I think you'd be relying for some internal growth and development from some of the other guys. Maybe you even account for HB starting to trend downwards a little bit, but you think that maybe De'Aaron can take another jump. Coach Brown is talking about him being mentioned with the elite, and that would just take consistency. Maybe he could do that. Maybe Domas can have that mid-range jumper we're talking about, or Keegan can take a big development, or Kevin and Malik are still pretty young. There's Davion, Kessler Edwards still around. So I think that there are still ways to go up if you're bringing back HB, but it's definitely reliant on internal improvement that I don't know is the most. I don't know if that's something you want to be betting on.
Do you think we see any change in pecking order with this team, namely Keegan Murray playing an even bigger role, maybe even being your number 2 scoring option in this offense next year behind De'Aaron Fox?
Yeah, that's interesting. I could see it. I still think that, maybe just solely when it comes to putting the ball in the basket, but obviously you're still going to run through Domas.
Sure.
I could see it. A lot of what Keegan showed throughout the course of the season and the playoffs itself really makes me think that the ceiling is higher than what I initially thought it was. So a big jump from Keegan is totally in the cards in my mind.
Is he enough of a creator right now? How much? Because to me, Brenden, when I watched Keegan, one of the things that we discussed before he was drafted by the Kings last summer was, he's not the most skilled isolation player. He's not, a super creator offensively. Does he not have to develop those skills pretty significantly to be a number 2 guy?
He definitely does. And that's why I kind of clarified in my mind is still running through Domas. But I think that he can get a lot of looks playing off of Sabonis, as we saw throughout the course of this year, and just kind of start to build off that a little bit, where if guys are closing out hard, take 2 dribbles and then a mid-range jumper, which we've seen like flashes of, but maybe doing that more consistently, or maybe 2 dribbles and then trying to go and finish through somebody at the rim. I feel like that's one of the big areas that he could really improve, and that'd still be within the flow of the offense, mainly playing off of Fox and Sabonis, but like upping his finishing would be really big. So there's definitely major strides that would need to happen in my mind when it comes to like his handle to be a full-on like number 2 creator. But I still think there's ways where he can really up his point production just playing off of the other 2 guys.
Where do you see the greatest opportunity for improvement with this basketball team heading into the offseason and the roster holes that they have now and the money that they have at their disposal right now?
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of decisions to make. It'll be interesting to see what happens with HB and Sasha Vezenkov if he comes over and how that would affect Trey Lyles. It's definitely an interesting spot. I think the biggest thing has to be defense, but not losing out on your offense in the process. I don't think that's why I'm not a fan of like moving Sabonis to the 4 and then bringing in a 5. That would help your defense, but it might really take away from your offense. And I think you need to make sure you keep that strength of offense, but just try to shore up on the defensive end best you can. And part of that just comes from this group already seeing that when they are locked in, like they were in the playoffs, that they're better defensively than I think they ended around 24th in the regular season. So they should just be better than that straight up. But I wouldn't be surprised to see, an additional move or kind of swing here for nothing too crazy, but just somebody to fill in that HB spot. Like, can you go and possibly figure out a way to sign and trade for Jeremy Grant or in OG Anunoby, So I think that figuring out some wing defense and maintaining your good spacing, high IQ offensive players would be pretty big for this team.
Brenden Nunes from the Kings Herald and the Kings Pulse podcast is with us on the Folsom Lake Honda Hotline. Folsom Lake Honda, your one-stop Honda shop. Brenden, I want to ask you about Vezenkov because, I've been talking about him the last couple of days, and I don't think there's much of an argument of what he can bring this team offensively. The question is, especially after that Warriors series, does he bring you enough toughness, and can he defend at the NBA level? Because if you've got him and Domas out there on the floor at the same time, that could end up being somewhat of a defensive nightmare.
It definitely could, and it's kind of lame that this is my answer, I guess, but I feel like that's a have to wait and see to how he evolves to the NBA game. It's a different style and sort of level of physicality required when he is going to be asked to sort of be on the perimeter, because I have the same concerns as you, but I had the same concerns with Trey Lyles as well, and that ended up working out. I do think that Sasha is a very smart player, and you can see that very clearly on the offensive end, and I think a lot of times that should translate to defense. It's just about a willingness to do it. So I think if there's an embracement of a role from Sasha, which is a big if, we're talking about a guy that is MVP candidate overseas and coming over and playing what I'd imagine is 6th, 7th guy role, if not lower. So I think if he embraced it, that there's potential, but, doesn't exactly have the most encouraging physical abilities when it comes to defense.
How much better does this defense need to get, Brenden? And do you think that there's going to be some drop off in the offense as the NBA sort of catches up to what they're doing and gets it all on tape?
I think that Domas developing that mid-range would be pretty big for, the league in general kind of figuring out their offense.
Mm-hmm.
And when it comes to the defense, I mean, they did okay regular season. You know, you could be more consistent, obviously, and you would strive to do that. But I really think it's just on the wings, you know, like Keegan Murray even is a guy that they're not quite putting on the more forwards and wings. A lot of times you see him on guard wings, Anthony Davis, Devin Booker, or not Anthony Davis, excuse me, Anthony Edwards, Devin Booker, and maybe you get a bigger wing like a OG Anunoby or a Pascal Siakam. I know Toronto's guys have gotten thrown around a lot. I mentioned Jeremy Grant. I really think wing forward defense would be pretty good for this team, because you look up and down the Western Conference and there's a lot of nights that you're dealing with a guy on the other side that is elite in that role, that right now, you know, maybe Harrison Barnes was your best option this year and you'd like somebody above that.
Brenden Nunes is with us on this Friday, Cattles and Ramie, Sactown Sports. Brenden, you've mentioned the idea of maybe OG Anunoby, Jeremy Grant. I know there are listeners that have been flooding in with the YouTube chats about possible trade ideas. What assets do they have? I mean, they're kind of handcuffed after the Herter deal with their first-round picks. Is Davion the most realistic young asset that you could see being dealt this offseason, or do you think that Monty would entertain trading Keegan Murray, because that's obviously the next guy on the list?
Yeah, I mean, I think that you definitely entertain the idea of trading Keegan, but they would want, I'd imagine, an already established star, and I don't know. It just have to be the right spot, you know. Is Paul George probably isn't the most appealing with his injury history. Like, I'm not even exactly sure off the top of my head who Keegan would have to be on the table for, maybe a Mikal Bridges or something like that. But I see that as pretty unlikely. I think that Davion's name is intriguing simply because I don't know if he can ever reach his ceiling on Sacramento, just with De'Aaron Fox being there. I think Davion sort of needs to be a one, and other teams could find him pretty interesting, and he could have decent value around the league. So he stands out to me. I think a Harrison Barnes side-in trade stands out to me. And you know, don't completely rule out the idea of them trading Kevin Herter. I'd be pretty surprised if it happened, but there's definitely a world where I think he's a part of conversations, if for nothing more like salary matching purposes as well.
Let me follow up. Do you think, in your heart of hearts, Brenden, do they have enough to deal to bring in somebody like Pascal Siakam? Because to me, I just don't think they have enough.
Pascal's a probably not. I think that OG could be on the table, and yeah, I think when you jump to the level of a Pascal, though, that it's probably not. You know, like they can come up with a decent package, but there's going to be a handful of other teams around the league that can probably beat it. A lot of it having to do with like just the pick restrictions in that Herder deal.
When you talk about Davion Mitchell, do you think he made himself a little bit more? Now, nobody's untouchable, but maybe a little bit more valuable and unmovable for the Kings with what he did in that series against the Warriors, because
they didn't play him in Game 7.
We're going to get to that. Calm down, Nick. But if you run into a Steph Curry again, and there are other guys in this league at that position that can kill you, who exactly are you going to give that assignment if Mike Brown wants to put a defensive player on that player in the future?
Yeah, I think that you need De'Aaron Fox to just kind of step up and embrace that role. And I think that he did an okay job in the playoffs, but obviously you don't want him doing that every single possession. Ideally, like, you can figure out one other backup that can just hound guards a bit. And, you know, maybe that is a PJ Dozier. Like, you can find a different version of a Matthew Dellavedova. I'd imagine that I don't know how much basketball he has left in his future. So I just don't think that there's many minutes for Davion on this team in the long term is kind of what it comes down to for me.
Brenden Nunes is with us here on the Folsom Lake Honda Hotline. Let's talk Foxy here for a minute, Brenden. I don't know how you felt about him and his ceiling heading into this season. I always said that I thought he could be, you know, a top 30, 35 guy. I still gave him a chance to be even better than that because of his youth and the lack of coaching that he received and really the lack of quality teammates that he's played with. But now, after witnessing this season and seeing what he did in the first, 4.5 games before that finger injury really, really took him out of that series for the most part, what do you think his ceiling is now?
It's a tough one. I mean, how consistent can he be, I think, is what it comes down to. We've seen him have great stretches. His fourth quarters obviously were phenomenal this season, but there's often times where one or two quarters you're just not feeling him that much out there. And he still has a focus that he takes away from the defense and sets up his teammates and all of that. I don't think that he's ever not trying out there or anything. It's just how often can you be the guy that is just going and getting buckets nonstop, setting up your teammates all the time? And I don't know what that answer is right now. I still think that we're talking sort of all-star and flirting with all-NBA, but not perennial all-NBA yet. I just think that it needs to be proven to me more consistently, or maybe he could come back with an even better jump shot, but I'm not really betting on that. I think the point he's at now is fine. It's just all about consistency. And until I see it, like the version that they got of De'Aaron last year is plenty for, like, you can't complain from there. And maybe he can keep taking that further.
How important do you think it is for the Kings to bring back Trey Lyles?
I don't know. If they feel good about Sasha Vezenkov, then I could see it being repetitive. Trey Lyles definitely did some tugging at my heartstrings in the exit interviews, talking about, that he's hopped around a lot and would love to sort of find a place and be able to stick around. And I like what Trey Lyles brings, but if you're talking about upgrading the defense, then maybe that's a spot that you look at where, okay, we'd rather our backup wing or forward to be a little bit more defensively versatile, or maybe you're bringing in Sasha and you feel like that fills that spot and would rather spend some of your resources elsewhere. So I really like Trey. I'd be a fan of bringing him back, but I'm not sure that you should feel like you need to.
Brenden Nunes is with us. Brenden, during the year, one of the things that really surprised me was, Monty didn't seem like he was too concerned about having a backup big behind Domas. We had, Frankie in studio going back when Nerlens Noel was available, and Frankie said, full stop, Monty's not interested. Just not going to happen. Do you think this offseason he's going to show a little bit more urgency addressing that situation?
I think that they will definitely figure out another way to add to that backup center. I don't think that it's going to be Chimezie Metu. Maybe it's Alex Len. I don't think it's going to be Alex Len. And we'll see what they do with Keita as well. But I think they're going to address it. I wouldn't expect them to spend any decent amount of money, but I think that they're like good minimum level players that are backup bigs. That is probably what you're going to see filled into that spot in my mind.
I know we're still a ways away from free agency. We still have the playoffs and the NBA finals to go on, but I'm just going to throw a name at you because we already know he's not going back to the team that he played for under any circumstances. How do you feel about Dylan Brooks in a Kings uniform?
I haven't thought about it enough, I guess.
Fair enough. Maybe that tells me all I need to know about how you feel about him in a Kings uniform.
I do think that he's going to end up solid on, I'm in a way have come around to rooting for him because he's getting a lot of crap, even though he brought it along himself, for sure. Mm-hmm. There's no two ways about that. But I do think that he's a really solid defender. I don't know if you feel like that he is going to embrace the newly found culture and fit a role, then I could see it.
Yeah, I'm out on him.
I guess.
I'm out on him. Brenden. Just say.
I don't want it. I don't want it.
Yeah, I don't want him. Or no, I'm all set. Last one from me today, and again, appreciate your time. When you look forward now, Brenden, how optimistic are you, or what makes you the most optimistic about this team building off of the momentum this year moving forward?
Got to be the youth. I mean, De'Aaron Fox is still young. Kevin Huerter and Malik Monk are still young. Domantas Sabonis is still what I would call young, and Keegan Murray and Davion Mitchell obviously are the most dramatics, the most extremes of just youth on this roster. So I think that, and finally in Sacramento having a coaching staff and a front office that seem to be on the same page, they're locked in. That's not a question anymore. Instead, you can just fully commit all your attention into, okay, what are we going to do for the roster? And I think that spells well moving forward. I think that expectations are going to make for a very different season next year compared to this year. Obviously, like playoffs and then everything is gravy after that. There's going to be higher expectations next year, and you got to be able to keep climbing from here. But that youth is definitely what I look at the most, and still having some of the ammo to maybe take one more swing.
What maybe makes you a little bit concerned about this organization moving forward, that they can not just match what they did this year, but build on it and improve on it and go even farther?
It's probably that same thing with expectations, is that, I don't know that a 3 seed is the most realistic for next year. And that's probably going to be somewhat of an expectation based on how you ended last year. And like, if next year is another first round exit in the playoffs, how do people feel? Because I think that's a very realistic outcome for this team. It's like, it feels great to have reached this point, but where do you keep climbing from here? I think that the internal improvement in the youth I talked about is a great hypothetical, but it is a hypothetical. There's a chance that these guys are what they are. But I think that they can find ways to improve, and also just maybe that swing that you take. I think that like Minnesota is a team I compared these guys, the Kings, a lot to this year, Minnesota of last year. And then you go out and take a swing and it's the wrong piece, and everybody knew, to be fair, that Rudy was the wrong piece for Minnesota. So hopefully it won't be.
Well, Minnesota did it, Brenden. Minnesota wasn't aware. Imagine you just could have kept Walker Kessler, just went on your way. That's all they had to do. Just keep the young big. Brenden Nunes, Kings Herald, Kings Pulse podcast. Thanks for joining us, man. Have a great weekend. We'll talk to you soon.
Thanks for having me, guys.
All right, there goes Brenden. He was on the Folsom Lake Honda hotline. Folsom Lake Honda, your one-stop Honda shop.